Speck had ran and ran. He had turned to so many corners that he was getting dizzy. He heard the alligators living in the sewers, but he never thought of grown-ups residing in the sewers would be a thing. But of course things change. He wasn't so sure how many greens were after him, and he didn't want to find out. He just wanted to get the hell out of there. Miracles and miracles, he finally stopped in some hinges and used to climb. He had climbed and climbed as fast as he could like a monkey on crack. He could hear the adults below him, growling, grunting, and hissing. Speck was safe. The adults didn't climb as far as he knew. He then reached a manhole covered and shoved it aside, and as he climbed out into the bright morning light, he looked around and saw the school several yards away. What was behind him was enemy lines. It was time to find the person responsible for this horde. He placed the lid back in the sewer hole and began to creep forward. The closer he got to the school, the louder the sound of the army greens grew. It wasn't as loud as before, but there had been several hundred greens. He had noticed smoke rising in the air. Something must have been set on fire. He crept on, trying to spot any adult that looked out of the ordinary. Whoever was responsible for this horde, they had to be close. They just had to. He had took out his gun and he got closer. The stench of death was beginning to become more prevalent. Speck wondered if there were still any more kids left. There had to be, or else the army would have moved on. As he saw the army completely surrounding the school, meaning there had to be kids in there with no way out. They must be scared shitless. Speck had fought to when he saw the tower's small enemy crawled around that church down one time. He knew those adults would get in eventually. He had to hurry and end this once and for all. Closer, closer, closer. Where are you, you son of a bitch? Or bitches? Speck's eyes scanned the area before him. He was crept as fast as he could. The stakes were very high. The second he counted, he imagined all the kids at the school hiding, scared, needing a miracle. And it was looking at the miracle that was about to happen, because Speck finally spotted the grown-up who had been responsible for his army. It was a man, maybe in his early 40s, a skin who looked fair, white, and looked the other adults whose skin was mossy green. Speck didn't know why that was, but he knew that it had to mean something. Next to him was another older-looking man, whose skin was green like the other adults. He was tall as the other man, had dark hair and dark clothing. He had evil written all over him. The thing was, he had kept looking over the man whose skin wasn't green, but they were answering to him. It was the same look he saw to give the other greens. Gave the tower when they were collecting bodies for him. No doubt about it, he was the man in charge. Speck's heart rate began to increase as he got the tunnel vision, with a sensation he was familiar with. Every time his dad went on a hunting and spotted a prey, Speck tried desperately to control his breathing. He huffled towards the man, eventually creeping up the bush to hide behind. He took an aim for his pistol. This ends now. It was over, Chris thought. They had just won just like they always did. The kids put one up hell of a fight and he gave them that. But at the end they just ended up fleeing back to the school, like a kid hiding under the covers from a monster hiding under their bed. It's funny how parents told their kids that there were no such thing as monsters, and it sure looked like they were wrong. Not only that monsters were real, they were monsters. Chris turned to Crony. I don't want to jinx myself, but I think we won this battle too. Crony smiled and his creepy smiled. Looks like you have. Then Crony's face exploded and he fell backwards. Chris just stood there dumbfounded, staring at his face in the pond of second command. Blood began to splatter from the back of his head and was frozen in that creepy smile. He turned back to whoever this person was responsible for killing Crony, and it would have been a kid hiding in the bush, aiming for something at him. A gun. Shit, how could he have been so foolish? Chris just stood completely frozen, forgetting that too he had a gun. He had several bright flashes coming from the barrel, and had a series of rapid blows strike him from the stomach that then rose to his chest. Chris then fell backwards and just lied there, completely stunned. The pain began to arrive. The puddle of his own blood began to form around him. He couldn't scream. All he could do was cause in his mind to help out the other adults. Help! Help, I'm dying! Some of the several adults began to surround him and took notice, as there was nothing more than roadkill in the middle of the street. Probably because he was about to. Just don't stand there, you frickin' dirtbags! Help me! But there was nothing the adults can do. They weren't doctors. They were just mindless drones. Chris's vision began to blur as descending into darkness. No, this can't be happening. I don't deserve this. I went to war with this country. I made so many sacrifices. I went through hell. I just can't die here because I was shot by some kid. He fought back the darkness, and soon all the faces of the adults began to transform and warp into faces of people he knew for his days from the army. They were people from his platoon. No, it can't be. You're all dead. I ate all of you. He saw his face of a little girl. I hate you too. What are you doing here? Your bones are buried in the middle of the frickin' desert somewhere in the Middle East. Chris began to regret everything he's ever done. Why did he join the military? If he didn't do just that, he would have never had the helicopter that was shot down. They were trying to rescue some civilians that had rescue extremist group that tried to evac. The chopper Chris was riding on was shot down, and the little girl were the only ones that weren't injured. They were trapped in around the middle of the desert, and Chris was hungry. He killed his fellow troops that were badly injured, as good as dead, and feasted on their bodies. He tried to share his food with the little girl, but she refused, so Chris ended up just killing her and eating her too. Once the adult ran out, he blurred their bodies, wandered around the desert for miles and miles. Just when he thought it was over, he found and rescued. He told the other officers that the enemy once killed his fellow soldiers. The helicopter he was riding was never found, so he was in the clear. No one was going to find out about his dirty little secret. Even he was one of his fellow soldiers' funerals. He cried for their families. He received medals and honorably discharged from the military. When he got a job at a random retail store where he worked, until the day the world changed, he just stared at the faces of the victims until his vision blurred, darkened again. He fought and fought again when they came back into view. They were no longer the bodies of people they used to know. They were werewolves or dogmen, angry, scowling, and growling. Not like this. The werewolves pounced on Chris, began to dig and devour him. Chris could still feel everything. Every bite, rip, tear. He was too weak to scream. And then it felt like descending, like hands of all of his victims were being dragged away, dragging him straight to hell. Not like this. Speck was sprinting back towards the school. He could barely contain his excitement. He'd seen everything. He'd seen the adults shuffle away from the school in droves that surrounded the man. They all just stood around him at first. They began to eat him. It felt like tide had turned. With no one controlled the army, the adults were too bound, dumb, and powerless. All Speck had to do now was to get back inside the school. He knew that from the front entrance of the school would be locked, so he would have to try the back since only like a few adults had gotten in. He waited for the last of the greens to exit, and then he went in. As he entered, the first thing he noticed were the dead bodies of the greens, taken out by traps, most likely set up by a girl called Luann. Several of the greens had been impaled by sharp spears. Others had been crushed by fallen lockers, textbooks, placed in large stacks. Speck was careful too not to trigger any more traps. Luckily, he had a good pair of eyes on him and noticed every little tripwire and possible trigger. As soon as he knew he was out of the hallway, he hastily made his way towards Voices, where the kids were in the foyer. At one moment, the adults were banging on doors, tearing away at pieces of plywood. The next day, they were gone. Everyone was confused by it. Again, the Loud Sisters were reminded of that one time a tornado passed their house. One moment it felt like the world was ending, and the next was peace and quiet. They could hear shuffling of feet moving away. Brock looked out towards the wooden boards. I don't understand. They're walking away. Everyone began to speak at once, some bombarding Brock with questions, while others went up to the boards to take a peek for themselves. What's going on? Lola asked. None of their siblings in particular. Luna responded with a shrug and said, Beats me. I'm just as in the dark as you are. Meanwhile, Luann's head thought of something how fitting could use the phrase in the dark, seeing as they were almost surrounded by darkness. Then a voice spoke up above the rest. I did it! Everyone jumped and spoke up back and looked at the kid at the foyer making his way over. Speck? Stan recognized his friend. Where the heck have you been? Didn't you hear me? I said I did it. Did what? I killed him, the adult who was responsible for this horde. I shot him multiple times and watched as the other adults feasted on him. Now several kids began to bombard Speck with questions, but he just ignored him and made his way towards the double doors in front of the foyer. Stan began to see a crazed look on his eyes. He then tried to open the doors, but they were locked. "What are you doing?" Brock asked. "We can't go out there." "Yes, we can," Speck told him. "I already told you. I took out the leader in his group, and now these grown-ups don't have a leader. No one's commanding them. They're blind. Now give me the keys and I can remove these chains and unlock the door." Brock hesitated at first, but Speck seized his uncertainty and swiped the keys from him. "Hey!" With lightning speed, Speck unlocked the doors and opened them, filling the room with warm morning light. Other kids screamed in protest, expecting the Greens to storm into the building, but nothing happened. Speck had turned his back to face the crowd. "Don't worry. Like I said, they're not going to do anything. Now come on. We don't need to strike while the iron's hot." He hurried over to the weapons rack and still had plenty of weapons and picked up the spike club, remembering from what Kevin and from Home Alone 2 said. "Don't you know a kid's always gotta win against 2 idiots? Well, imagine 50 kids going against 500 idiots." He wasn't so sure if those numbers were correct, but he just wanted to make a point. He stormed out of the building, leaving all the kids stunned and confused. "What should we do?" Aubrey asked Brock. Brock held up his nail back. "I don't know about you, but I'm feeling quite invigorated." He too ran out of the building as Speck, not before taking one last glance at everyone else, telling them to follow. Everyone stood around. Lexi gripped her axe and then ran back outside, prompting a few other kids to follow. The loud siblings all looked at each other. "What should we do?" Luann asked. "You know what I'm doing," Lynn said as she gently placed Lana aside, then stood up and charged out of the house with the spike club. Luna called after her, but the athletic girl ignored her, and of course disappeared through the doors. The musician swore and turned it back to Lincoln. "Keep an eye on the others, please." Lincoln nodded. Luna stood up, and so did Luann. "I'm coming too." Maggie and Cooper were ready to charge in the battle too. They rearmed themselves and went back inside. At the other end of the foyer, Stan was wanting some revenge as well. He had turned back to Mary and her brother Matt. Mary was beginning to stir. Mary then saw Norman standing a few feet away from them, crying as well. Stan went over and had to lift the crying boy to his feet and lend him over to Mary. "Keep an eye on her," he told him. It was without a question. Norman sniffled and nodded. Stan knelt next to Mary, the most important person in his life, and said goodbye for that moment. He picked up his mace and then shot the most important thing in his life and hurried outside. Shane watched everyone run back inside and took another puff of his joint. Well, you know how the turntables." He noticed Mary Jane standing next to him with her arms crossed. "Aren't you going out there too?" she asked. Shade sighed. "All right." Speck then reached to the closest adult, who still had his back turned to the school, just like any other Green that struck them hard. The adult went down with little resistance. Speck then took out another adult, and then another. It was like a bunch of mannequins at first, and the Greens began to become more aware of this commotion, turned back on the kids. None of them were wielding weapons anymore. They were too stupid to comprehend holding something. A lot of them came out of their arms and tried to grab the kids and began to beat them down. They were like zombies. They were like stupid to hold on to something. But of course, no more round of Call of Duty zombies were slow and weak. Soon all the fighters from the school were outside, beating down the defenseless horde. Some of the younger kids from the school even left the building to watch the massacre. A lot of them had huge dumb grins on their faces. Luna had gotten another axe from chopping down adults again, only this time chopping down the saplings. Luann had a mad grin on her face as she was no longer being scared. She struck the adult with her head of the club. "That's using the old noggin," she joked. Lynn was about to go down the adults like they were punching more mannequin dummies. At this point, it was clear to everyone that they were going to win. Several of the kids got cocky and took their turns killing the adults. Going for the hits wouldn't immediately kill them. At some point, chop off their limbs and beat them to it. Brock had told everyone not to slow down. As soon as they beat the horde, the better. As Luna continued to chop their heads, she heard a kid next to her speak. "Oh God, I recognize this one. His name was Bob." Luna felt bad for the adults. It wasn't their fault they were like this, but at the same time the kids show no mercy, so why should they? She then wondered if she would ever see their familiar faces again, as she saw the fact that the older looking adult holding a pillow. She recognized her journalism, Mr. Sonderland. "Sorry, Mr. S," she said as she swung the axe, and pulled him out of his misery. It was then at that moment they began to accomplish what they finally arrived. The last of Grown-up's body hit the ground. It was all over. They won. They steadied the ground and putting the few adults who still writhed on the ground. One kid began to laugh manically, and another one began to hoot and holler. "Fuck yes!" Another kid shouted. Luna looked at her siblings. They were all covered in blood, but that didn't stop them from smiling. "We did it!" she shouted. "We are champions!" They began to laugh and embrace each other. Then they began to make their way back into school. Luann glanced over and saw Maggie walking beside her. The dark-haired girl looked over at the comedian. Luann stopped and smiled at her, which made her stop too. "Thanks," the comedian said. A small giggle crept up Maggie's face, and then Luann just pecked on her shoulder. Maggie was stunned by the momentarily, and slowly brought up to the hand to the spot where Luann had kissed her. Then a small, big, goofy smile on her face, walked back with Luann in hand. "This was terrible first date, though," Luann said with both they laughed. As they continued to walk, Lynn noticed Cooper looking around, as he spotted and hurried over with a smile on his face. "What?" Lynn asked. "Nothing," he said. "It's just that I never got a chance to a game of basketball." Lynn suddenly remembered how Cooper challenged her to a game of one-on-one. She smiled and said, "It's a date." His smile faltered. He looked nervous. "What?" "It's just a figure of speech," Lynn said in a mocking tone. The last siblings then reached the school, and in another great coincidence, Luna bumped into Sam. "Oh, hi," Luna said as if everything in the last hour had just happened. "Hey," Sam said with a soft smile. "It looks like we just got another time to jam together." Luna smiled. "I've got nothing but time." Back outside, Brock wandered around, putting down any of adults that showed signs of life. He spotted several adults who were struggling underneath that tall adult with an axe in his back. "You must be Tower," Brock said as he studied it. "Gosh, hate to meet that person who did this to you." "Yeah, you would," a voice said behind him. Brock turned to see Joey emerging from the pile of dead bodies. A few kids standing around the ground gasped as Joey stood amongst the tall bodies. He then went over to the tower and removed his axe, shoveled his over, and picked up a spear. "This was Duke's spear," Joey said coldly. It was so hard to understand that Joey was saying, since he lost 2 of his front teeth, but Brock heard him. I'm so sorry," was all he could think to say. "I am too," Joey responded. Then he too slowly walked back towards the school. Shade looked around and noticed the dead bodies, then looked back to MJ. "Looks like things might go back to normal now," he said. Shade just shook his head and nodded. "Things are never getting back to normal." Stan and Speck walked back to the school. "I just can't believe we did it," Stan said, "and we were able to sneak through the sewers and kill the adult who led that freaking army." Speck nodded, and what's weird is that his skin wasn't green like the adults. He looked normal. "Wonder why is that?" Speck shrugged. "I guess there was just so many questions that left unanswered." "So, what, do we even want those questions answered?" "Maybe." Stan shrugged. "Well, we'll worry about that later. Right now I just want to relax." Stan, and Speck finally walked back to the school. Stan checked on Mary, whose brother hadn't left her side, and Stan reached for her hand. He squeezed his hand, and for the first time in a while, Stan felt gently smiled. A few feet away, Clyde was taking his last breath, surrounded by Lincoln and his sisters. "We did it, Clyde," Lincoln said, still holding his best friend's hands. "We won." Clyde gave a weak smile. "That's great, man." Lola sniffled. "We're never going to forget you, Clyde." All the other sisters agreed. "Thank you for always being with us," Lana also said. "You'll always be a part of our family," Luna told him. Clyde nodded weakly. With his last ounce of life, he turned to Lincoln and said, "Clinton McCloud forever." Lincoln nodded. "Clinton McCloud forever." He gave his friends a firm squeeze as he felt his grip loosened. Lincoln held his hands and to his forehead began to weep. All of his sisters began to embrace and wept too. Hopefully for the last time. Back outside the school, Brock stood as he let out a huge mass of bodies. He turned to see some of the kids who stood around him. He saw his cousin Gage, who was sitting down crying for some reason, might as well as Granta's younger sister. The farm boy had turned and saw Brock looking at him, grabbed his sibling's hands and walked away. Aubrey approached him and said, "Looks like we got some cleaning up to do," she said. "Yeah, we do," Brock responded. "But first, I need a shower." Cornelius Tucker stood on the front of the roof like he always did. He was exhausted, and everyone else had spent weeks trying to burn the dead bodies of adults and bury the remains of their fellow kids, while the others went out and scavenging supplies. Luckily, all the stores had tons of food since the disease had struck so suddenly. No one was able to get anything else, so the stores were left untouched, except for a few lone adults here and there, but they were easily taken care of. The world was safe. The kids were free to roam the streets again. It was time to rebuild society. Tucker's dream of seeing people walk around again the streets, living their lives to the fullest, as soonly became a reality. But not today. Today he just stood there, stared into a clear, starry night. He then heard thunder. That was weird from what he could tell. There were no clouds in the sky, no flashes of lightning in the distance. Then a rumbling sound grew louder and louder. Tucker scanned the horizon and saw something long and massive approaching. He watched as it got closer. "No way," he said out loud. "It can't be." He ran back inside the school to alert the others. Soon all the big kids were in the front of the lawn of the school, while the younger kids were locked in from the inside. Then the massive approaching object was right in front of the school. Everyone could see what it was. A massive semi-truck pulling a large trailer behind it. It slowed and then stopped as soon as it was in the front of the school. It just sat there for quite a while. The truck's loud engine droned on and on. Eventually Brock shouted at whoever was driving the truck, "Show yourself!" He began to shouting, intimidating around it. He could hardly be heard over the engine. Then the truck shut off and the night was thrown into the eerie silence. After a few more seconds, the door to the tractor opened and everyone raised their weapons. The kid stepped out. He was a boy who had fair skin and dark hair. He was a well-fenced kid and he looked to be 16, which they all hope it wasn't the case as he was just older than how he looked. Back inside the school, Lincoln and his younger siblings stood in front of the window and watched a bizarre scene. "What's going on, Lola asked, as she and the sisters were holding on to their older brother. "I don't know," he said, sadly hushing his younger sister, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Back outside, Brock demanded to tell the kid who he was, pointing the nail bat at him. The kid smiled and held his hands up. "Don't worry about me, I come in peace." "For your sake, you better be true. Now tell us your name and why you're here and where you came from and where you found that thing." "It's kind of a long story," the boy said. "We got time," Brock said back. The boy's smile grew wider. "We'll get in there when I come in from the moment. But for now, my name is Jack Wright. I stumbled upon this truck as it has something that could be made of some use. I just needed a few people to share with me on it to help it out. It looks like you guys could use some help." Jack held a smile as the kids in front of Royal Woods Elementary School looked at each other in confusion. Things were suddenly about to change when it was going to be yet for better to be seen again. A 6-year-old boy named Jason Woods was staring up into the starry sky. He always loved stargazing. He was staring up at the vast beyond space, wondered what was out there. It was one of the few things a person could do in this messed up world. Several yards away from him, a school building was burning to the ground, with several yards in each direction. Members of his group were talking about their pent-up anger and aggression on the poor, unfortunate teenage girl, while several yards in every direction, adults were feasting on the corpses of the younger kids. Jason felt his crew was truly blessed by the powers with pre-orders around and went mad. It'd always been the other way. They had to take orders from the adults. Well, not anymore. The world had changed. It had given them a gift they can use to take revenge on this unjust world. Jason noticed that one kid was standing several yards away from this action. He went over to the boy and put an arm around him. "What's wrong, Logan? You won't want to get on that?" He then pointed at the girl for that moment was being violated by several other teens at once. Logan shook his head. "No thanks. I am the sloppy one of the 1 in seconds. Jason could see that sense that someone else was on the kid's mind, something he didn't like. Remember our motto? Jason told him. No more heroes, Logan simply said. Right, no more heroes. You don't have to participate right now, but there will come a time when you have to do so, so don't get soft. That's how you ended up here in the first place. You feel me? Logan nodded. Jason patted him on the shoulder and said, Jason made his way over to the girl, passing by a few members of his group. There was another 16-year-old girl named Lydia. She was second in command. No one messed up with her. There was also an Asian kid named Hashiko Hirozaki. Just stood there, completely still with holding his katana in stealth. He was the only kid in the group who imitated Jason, mostly because he never said a word. He then passed by a kid whose name was Jeffy. He had wore a blue bicycle helmet, yellow shirt, and blue jeans, and for some reason wore a diaper on the outside of his pants. He just stood there with his mouth open, smacking his groin. Several other kids asked him why he did that, but every time he just responded by saying, I don't even know. Finally, he reached a girl whose last were a few kids were gaining up on her. They all had pulled their pants and yet walked away. The only kid remained was the boy writing in his notebook. He always was writing. He did write about anything. A lot about stories, mostly involved of adult things and sick stuff like torture. He wore a leather jacket over his t-shirt and the pants and brown shoes. He also had an American flag tied around his neck like a cape, thus earning him the nickname Flaggy. That was when he ended up in youth jail for killing someone by strangling with the flag. You're almost done, Flaggy? Jason asked the boy. Almost. Flaggy was taking every last detail of beat-up girl, so he could get a better reference as to what he wrote about stories about those certain subject matter. Done. He closed his notebook, put it back in his backpack with the other notebooks, and walked away. Jason studied the girl, who was covered up in hours' worth of cuts, bruises, and etc. Her eyes were red from crying, but they weren't visible tears. You've run out of tears yet, haven't ya? The girl was too weak to even respond. All came out was a wet, gurgled sob. Don't worry, he said. I know how that feels. He then took out a machete and raised it, brought it down on the girl, and ended on her misery. He walked away as the adults swarmed the body to devour it. They didn't care that it was covered in, well, you know. Come on, everyone, he shouted. We still got a long way to go. He walked away in front of the group of hundreds of crazy, vicious, blood-sucking, thirsty teens. The hell-bent of destruction, with only one goal in mind: kill everyone.